Today's daf is Yevamos, daf Chof Dalid, and we are 8 lines from the top of daf Chof Dalid Amud Aleph, the Mishnah. Today's daf is being learned as a schus before Shalom for Vadi ben Miriam Leah, Moshe Abba ben Devorah bas Mecha, Shmu ben Tehila, Elazar Lipa Shalom ben Feger Rachel, Sarah Nechama bas Rus Malka, Baruch ben Rachel, Yisachar ben Hindel Liba, Malka Miriam bas Esther, and Esther Kreindel bas Devorah. Today's daf is also being learned Le'ilu Nishmas Shlomo ben Yibad L'chaim Tovim Reb Chaim Doiv, and Le'ilu Nishmas Doiv Beryl ben Reb Yaakov David. So today's daf is a relatively light daf. It deals with Yesodis related to Masechtas Yevamos, however, without some of the intensity of some of the dafim that deal with Yesodis related to Masechtas Yevamos. So we're familiar with the basic concept of Yibum. It says in the Torah, Ki yeshvu achim yachdav. If there will be two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, umeis achad mehem, and one of them dies, Reuven ein loy, and he leaves over no children. Says the Torah, Reuven's alman is not simply allowed to just go ahead and marry anyone that she wants. Rather, Shimon, the brother that's alive, has a mitzvah to be miyabim eshes Reuven. What happens if, when Reuven died, he left over not just one brother Shimon, but several brothers? Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun. What happens if, when Reuven died, he left over not just one wife, but multiple wives? Do all the brothers have to do Yibum? Do all the Yevamos have to have either Yibum or Chalitza in order for them to be able to get married? So the answer is, this is Yevamos 101. Of course not. One Yavam needs to do either Yibum, the Chalitza, to one Yavam. And as soon as one Yavam is Miyabim, or is Chayl, it's one of the Yavamis, the halach is all the Yavamim are parted from their mitzvah, and all the Yavamais are now mutaris l'shok. They're allowed to get married to anybody that they want to get married. There was a very fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish on that Amud Beis with regards to the lumdis of how exactly that works. Rabbi Yochanan holds that when one Yavam does Yibum or Chalitza, he's acting as a shliach, he's acting as an agent on behalf of all the other Yavamim. So really, all the Yavamim need to do either Yibum or Chalitza. But the Chiddush of Yibum says that when one Yavam does the Yibum or Chalitza, he's a shliach on behalf of all the other Yavamim, shluchai shaladim to Maisai, and therefore it's as if they did it. The same is true for the Yevamos, said Rabbi Yochanan. When one Yevama receives Yibum or Chalitza, she acts as a shliach on behalf of all the other Yevamos, and therefore it's considered as if all of them received the Yibum or Chalitza as well. Reish Lakish argued. Reish Lakish says no. The Yavam that does Yibum, he's the Miyabim, and the one that does Chalitza, he's the Chaylet. And the same is true for the Yevama. The one that receives the Yibum, the one that receives the Chalitza, she's the one that ultimately partook in this mitzvah. What about everybody else? No, they did it. Avada Reish Lakish is Maida, that once one Yavam does Yibum or Chalitza, all the other Yavam are going to be pater. And Avada Reish Lakish is Maida, that once one Yavama receives the Yibum or Chalitza, all the other Yavamas are going to be pater. But in terms of the lumdis, how it works, according to Rabbi Yochanan, when one Yavam and one Yavama do the mitzvah, it's as if they all did mitzad the halacha of shlichus. According to Reish Lakish, there is no shlichus, and it's the Yavam and the Yevama that engaged in the mitzvah that are the ones that are Mekayim the mitzvah. Stating that, here's the question. So Reuven dies, he leaves over not just Shimon, but Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, several brothers. Which one of the brothers has the schus to be the one to do the Yibum or the Chalitza? You make a goyrel? Is there one that actually has the schus? It's a mitzvah. So who is it that has the schus to be able to do the mitzvah? That is the topic of the first part of today's daf. Zok the Heilige Mishnah. Mitzvah begadol liyabim. The mitzvah is for the gadol, the oldest of the brothers, to do the yibum. However, if one of the younger brothers went and he preempted the gadol and he did the yibum or the chalitza, of course it's going to work. But you want to know who has the mitzvah? Mitzvah begadol liyabim. There's a din lechatchila for the gadol, the eldest of the brothers, to be the one that's going to do the yibum. Says the Gemara. How do you know? It's Tanu Rabbanon. Brisa, and this brisa is a very, very important brisa because it's going to darshan one of the psukim in the parasha of Yibum, and the drashas that emerge from this brisa are very, very critical drashas to understanding the very basics of Yibum. So the first pasuk we just mentioned, What's the second pasuk? Yakum al Shem Achav Hameis v'lo yimachish shmoi b'Yisrael. Now, it's impossible to learn this pasuk without looking in Rashi and the Teresh V'Alpeh and not be mefarish the pasuk as follows. The pasuk says there's a mitzvah of Yibum, and then the pasuk says v'hoya b'chor asher teiled, that it will be in the event that a child will be born through the Yibum. So the oldest child that will be born, Yakum al Shem Achav Hameis, he will be in place of the brother that died, and that will assure that this person, Reuben, who died and left over no children, won't be machui mi-Yisrael. He won't be wiped off the face of the earth. He's going to have a continuation. He's going to have some perpetuity. He's going to have a hamshach. So what the pasuk seems to be saying is that what's the tachlis of the Yibum? So that there should be a child. He will be, quote unquote, Yakum al Shem Achav Hameis. And like this will assure v'lo yimachish shmoi b'Yisrael. Stating that the Gemara is about the darshan this pasuk, and what's going to emerge from the drasha is anything but the way we just explained it. Says the Gemara, we learn from Mishnah that there's a mitzvah for the Bechar to do the Yibum. V'haya Bechar is not referring to the oldest child that was born as a result of the Yibum, but rather V'haya Bechar is referring to the Yavam, as if the V'haya Bechar is a continuation of the previous pasuk. Yevamos yava yoleh ulekachalei liisha v'yivma. Who? Which brother? V'haya Bechar. It's the Bechar, it's the oldest one. He's the one that should do it. An islandess is a woman that can't have children, and as a result, she's exempt from the mitzvah of Yibum. Incidentally, even though one of the big sugis in Masechtas Yevamos is the sugi of Tsaras islandess, Ravasi's chiddush that Tsaras islandess asura, lemute de Ravashi, asuye de Ravasi, right? It's one of the themes of Masechtas Yevamos is the shita of Ravasi. But not to make the mistake, the chiddush of Ravasi was that the tzara of the islandess is also. But as relates to the islandess herself, it's pashut she's excluded from the mitzvah of Yibum. It's pashut she has a din of an eishasach shaloi b'malka mitzvah. She has absolutely no connection to the mitzvah. But either way, it says in the Torah, we learn from here, from the fact that it says we learn that an islandess is excluded from the mitzvah of Yibum. Yakum al Shem Achiv. What does that mean? Lenachala. That the Yavam that does the Yibum, he's the one that yarshins his brother. Meaning, when a man dies, if he leaves over possessions, there's a Dina Yerusha. Someone's going to yarshin his possessions. So who yarshins it? So ordinarily, there's a Seder of Nachlos. The Torah talks about it in Parshas Pinchas. It's mentioned in Shas, in Perikei Shvaychlin, in Masechtas Bava Basra, but there's a whole Seder of exactly how Yerusha works. The Torah says that V'hoya b'chor asher teiled Yakum al Shem Achiv. You know what that means? What it means is that the Bechor, which is the Yavam, the oldest Yavam who has the schus to do the Yibum, he's going to yarshin his brother. You do Yibum, you get the Yerusha. Says, is that really pshat? Maybe what it means is something else. Maybe what it means is not V'hoya b'chor is referring to the Yavam, but rather it's referring to the child that was born. So V'hoya b'chor asher teiled, the child that was born, Yakum al Shem Achiv, will be named after his father. So we should name him after the Ach Hameh. So for example, Yosef, in the event that the brother that died was Yosef, so throughout all the Rishonim, it's either Reuben or Shimon, but in the Gemara, it's Yosef, Yosef, we'll name him Yosef. Yochanan, if his name was Yochanan, Yochanan, we'll call him Yochanan. Maybe that's what it means when it says Yakum al Shem Achiv. It says over Yakum al Shem Achiv, never allowed on, and it says somewhere else, al Shem Acheim, Yikaru b'nachalas. Mashema abu b'alon nachlo. Just like where it says Shem, what does it mean? It means nachla. Shema amar kan. So too where it says Shem over here, what it means is nachla. So what does Yakum Hashem Achad means? It means that the Yavam gets to yarshin his brother that died. And finally, we learn from there prat the sarish shmai machi. If Reuben was a saris, he was someone that physically was not able to have children. So being that his shmai was machi anyways, he anyways couldn't have a hemshach. So therefore, there's not going to be a mitzvah now for his brother to go ahead and be miyavi. So this brisa, which teaches us some very important halachas. Number one, mitzvah begadol liyapim. Number two, an islandess doesn't fall Yibum. Number three, the brother that does Yibum gets to keep the entire Yerusha. And number four, if the Achames, Ruvain, or in our daf, Yosef or Yochanan, was a saris, there's no mitzvah of Yibum either. Where's it learned out from? The pasuk that says, V'hoya b'chor asher teiled Yakum al Shem Achiv Ameis lo yimachish shmoi Yisrael. And again, if you read that pasuk the pasuk does not seem to say what the Gemara darshan. The pasuk seems to say the purpose of Yibum is have a baby, and then the baby will be Yakum al Shem Achiv Ameis, which literally sounds like name this child after the late father. So that so his name, literally, his name will not be wiped away in Yisrael. But the Gemara darshan is completely different. The V'hoya b'chor is not the child that's born. It's referring to the oldest brother. He's the one that has the schus to do Yibum. Ashnetele is referring to the Yevamos. She has to be a woman that's Ruyu Lahayle. Yakim Hashem Achav Ameis is Nachla, it's Yerusha, based on Exer Shava. And V'lo Yamachish might be Yisrael means that in the event that Reuven was a Saris, so he's not going to be included in the mitzvah of Yibum. Says the Gemara. Amar Rava said, even though we have a principle, we have a rule that in Kol HaTeirah, although there's so many drashas in Chazal, the entire backdrop of what we do every day, of Daf Yomi, of Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi, it's darshaning psukim. So even though we constantly darshan psukim, and we seem to be mefarish psukim that really are sometimes not even reminiscent of the Pashup Shah, still we have a principle that at the end of the day, the Pashup Shah is still Pashup Shah. What does that mean? There's something called drush, there's something called remez, there's something called side, but there's of course also something called pshat. So whatever the pashup pshat is, that's always going to be emes. Now there may be emes in addition to the pashup pshat, all the drushes of Chazal, even if they're not the pashup pshat, but they're oichet emes. But the pshat is also emes. So there's a principle of emek yoytze v'dei pshutoy. So it says, Rabbi, that's true in Kol HaTeirah Kula, with one exception. Over here it's different. Because over here the Gzei Reshava says that the pashup pshat in the pasuk is not the pashup pshat in the pasuk. What exactly was it referring to? The pashup pshat in the pasuk sounds like that the firstborn child that's going to be born should be named after the man that died. What's the real pshat? The oldest brother has a schus to do Yibum, and when he does Yibum, he gets to Yarshim the entire Nachla. And really what it hinges on is, what does it mean, Yakim al Shem Achav HaMeis? Does Yakim al Shem Achav HaMeis means he should be named after the mace? If it means he should be named after the mace, then the Bahaya Bechar is referring to the oldest child that was born. When he's born, Yakim al Shem Achav HaMeis. If, however, Yakim al Shem Achav HaMeis is referring to the Yavam, and what it's saying is that he gets the Yarshin, so then the Bahaya Bechar must be referring not to the oldest child, but it's the Yavam. So Bahaya Bechar, it's going to be the oldest child. He has the schos to do the Yibum, and Yakim al Shem Achav HaMeis, when he does the Yibum, he's the one that's going to end up with the Josh. And how did we know that Yakim al Shem Achav HaMeis means Yerusha? Was based on Exer Shava. It says Yakim al Shem Achav, v'nemel lahalan al Shem Achem Yikar v'nachalasam, and Masham, just as over there was the Nachlo, so over here it's the Nachlo, and this Zera Shava is being waiting midday Pashup Shad in the pasuk. And Rava said, even though we have a principle that in Kol HaTeirah Kula make you this is an exception to the rule. Over here, the Pashup Shad is moitzi. Over here, the Pashup Shad is not the Pashup Shad, and rather what we darshan is we darshan it based on what emerged from the Zera Shava. Says the Gemara. Now, if you have Zera Shava, have a mina shem shem mamish. Sounds like what Rava is saying is that we're not for Zera Shava. I would have thought when it says Yaakov Hashem Achiv, what does it mean? It means literally you should name the child after the person that died. So the Gemara says, Pashup Shah in the pasuk, even though it feels like what it's saying is that when the child is born, you should name him after the person that died. But really, if you look at the pasuk a little bit more carefully, and if you look at the pasuk more, here's the key word, grammatically, it doesn't really seem to line up. Why? Because it says the Gemara, who would the pasuk be talking to? Meaning this pasuk, in the Pashup Shat, not the way the Gemara is darshaning in the price based on the Xer Shal, that it's referring to the child that's born. So if there's a child that's born through the Yibum, Yakim al Shem Achav. Who's the Torah saying, quote, Yakim al Shem Achav? Who's the Torah talking to? Either Yavam, if it's talking to the Yavam, Yakim al Shem Achicha mibayalei. If the pasuk's telling Yavam, you have a child, when it's going to be a bris, it's going to be the Yikari Shmai Yisrael, make sure if it's Yosef, if it's Yochanan, if it's Reuben, if it's Shimon, whoever it is, so it should say, name him after your brother, right? The Yavam is the brother of the mace. So why does it say Achiv? It should say Achicha. Now, either way, maybe it's referring to Bezdin. So it's telling Bezdin, you make sure that in the event that there's a child that's born, name the child after his brother. It should be named the child Al Shem Achiyav Mibayale. Name him after the child's brother's, the child's father's brother, right? Because you're not naming him after his brother. It's not the baby's brother. It's the baby's father's brother who was the Achames. So the Gemara says that's not a time. Meaning, what the Gemara is trying to say is that I don't know how you could read the Pashut Pshat the way Rava understood the Pashut Pshat. Because if the Pashup Shah and the pasuk is it's referring to the baby, named the baby after the Achames, then either it should have said Achicha if we're talking to the Yavam, or it should have said Achiyaviv if we're talking to Bezdin and we're telling Bezdin who to name the child after. It's the child's uncle. It's not the child's brother, it's the child's uncle. That's who we're naming him after. So says the Gemara, doesn't sound like the Pashup Shot lines up anyways. So if the Pashup Shot doesn't line up, why do we need Xer Shava to be Moitzi from the Pashup Shot? The Pashup Shot anyways doesn't work. The Gemara says it's not a tiny. Maybe this is what the Pasuk is saying. Meaning, Bezdin is talking to Bezdin, and they're telling Bezdin, Imrule the Yavam, tell the Yavam, Yakum Hashem Machav. Tell the Yavam that he should name the baby after his brother. Oh, that's what it is. It's not the Torah talk. If the Torah was talking straight to the Yavam, Torah would talk straight, right? Torah would say straight, Yashar. Name him after your brother. But the Torah is not talking to the Yavam. The Torah is talking to Bezdin. And they're telling Bezdin, quote, go tell the Yavam that the baby should be named after his brother. Oh, that's why the Lashon of Achiv is the proper Lashon. The bottom line is, what would the Pashup Shah be? The way we explained it, because we have Xer Shava, Afikte Legamri, that's Moitzi Legamri from the Pashup Shah, and says Rava, even though ordinarily the rule is that even when we use drush of this is an exception to the rule. Over here we are moitzi midei pshuta. So what's the makar to the halach in the Mishnah? The Mishnah said mitzvah begadol liyavim. What's the makar to it? V'hoya b'chor ashetele. Being moitzi this pasuk midei pshuta. And what we're saying is that the b'chor is not the firstborn child, but it's the oldest brother. He's the one that has the schos to be the person to do the evil. Says the now that we said, and when it says in the Torah, what's it referring to? It's referring to the oldest brother. He is the one that has the schos to do Yibum. Maybe only the oldest brother should have a mitzvah to do Yibum, but maybe one of the other brothers should not have a mitzvah to do Yibum. Meaning, maybe doesn't just mean that the Bechar has a schos to do it first. Maybe it's either him or no one. Right? The pasuk says, and this is the you're telling me the Bechar is the oldest brother. That's who it means. Okay, so the Torah just said the oldest one is the Bechar. He's the one that does the Yibum. How do you know that one of the other brothers has a mitzvah to do it? So the Gemara says like a Shema Keteris. Because if that's true, that only the oldest brother has a mitzvah to do Yibum, but if it's not the Bechar, then there's no Yibum. Then Eishes Achiv Shleihai Ba'ilami. Why do I need a miyut of Eishes Achiv Shleihai Ba'ilami? The case of Eishes Achiv Shleihai Ba'ilami is where the brother died, and then after he died, another brother was born. Now, that brother that was born after his brother died, by definition, this is easy math. This is not complicated Yevamos. This is straightforward. Can't be the oldest brother, because if someone's oldest brother died, then by definition, he's not the Bechar. So the Gemara says from the fact that we need a drasha ki yesh la'achem yachda v'shiva achas ba'ilom to be memayit eishes actually that's a raya that it's not only the Bechar that does Yibum. There's only the Bechar that does Yibum. Then that by definition would knock out eishes actually ba'ilom. So I wouldn't need yeshiva achas ba'ilom. I would know it from the Hoya Bechar. But the Gemara says Parach said I don't know if that's buchach because the emel lamute buchar de imel. Maybe when it says Hoya Bechar, it means it has to be a Bechar. Now, usually you think of a Bechar, you think of the father's oldest son. But maybe it doesn't have to be the father's oldest son. Maybe it could be the mother's oldest son as well. And as long as this child meets the criteria of a Bechar, whether it's a Bechar la'av or Bechar la'im, maybe that's enough for this child to be able to do Yibum. So it's possible to have an Eishes actually where that brother is going to be a Bechar. Not a Bechar la'av because he died, but a Bechar la'im. So maybe that's why you need the miyut of meaning la'ila, maybe only Bechar is able to do it because it says in the Torah v'haya Bechar. But maybe when it says v'haya Bechar, it means either Bechar la'av or Bechar la'im, and that would explain why I need Eishes Achshloy b'ilama in a case where the younger brother was a Bechar la'im, which is very possible. They were Achim and Av, which is the criteria for Yibum. They weren't Achim and Aim, and he was a Bechar v'imai, and as a result, you would think he has a mitzvah of Yibum, were it not for the fact that Eishes Achshloy b'ilama. You can't say that. The Yibum v'nachla taler rachmana v'nachla and other way because we know Yibum is taler and nachla, like we just darshan that brother is the one that goes ahead and he yarshins and miyuchad v'nachla, like we had the Gemara in the beginning of the second paragraph. But the bottom line is Yibum we know is only about relationships from the father, not from the mother, and it's for that reason it's not possible that if it says in the Torah b'haya Bechar, it would mean Bechar la'em, must mean Bechar la'av, and if it means Bechar la'av, and only the Bechar la'av is able to miyab, and you shouldn't need a miyab of Eishes Achshloy b'ilama. So the Gemara says that can't be. It can't be that only the Bechar is able to do Yibum. Okay, so it must be. What does it mean when it says V'haya Bechar? It means he has a schos. That's the Mishnah. Mitzvah of the God, Yibum. But at the same time, the Mishnah says, when Kadam HaKadam Zachat, the Kadam comes afterwards, he's going to be okay. So it says the Gemara, I don't know the possibility. Maybe Kiyek Bechar, this guy mitzvah Yibum. Maybe if there's a Bechar, there's going to be a mitzvah Yibum. But if there's no Bechar, wait this guy mitzvah Yibum. Maybe, true, it's not only the Bechar that does Yibum. But at the same time, maybe the only time there's a mitzvah of Yibum is if there is a Bechar. But if there's no Bechar, maybe there's not going to be any mitzvah of Yibum at all. So if there's a Bechar, there's Yibum, but if there's no Bechar, there's no Yibum. What would be the lumdus in such a thing? So the Ritva says that maybe the lumdus would be that really the Bechar has the mitzvah. Like it says, but it's possible for one of the other brothers to do it as a shliach of the Bechar. Feels a little bit like Shittas Rabbi Yochanan on Daf Yud that we spoke at again in the introduction. But maybe one of the other brothers could do it as a shliach. But the only time the shlichus is going to work is if the Bechar is there. But if there's no Bechar, it's not going to work. So the Gemara says, Amakra can't be. Because it says in the Torah, Umeis achad mehen. Now, Umila Yaskir in the Mitzbechar, V'amir Achmanu Liyavin Katan. It says there were Kiesh Achim Yachtav. Sounds like there were only two brothers, right? Achim, Miyut, Achim Ishnayim. And one of them died. Presumably, even the older one. And still it says that there's a mitzvah to go ahead and do Yibum. So you see clearly, even when there's no Bechar, there's a mitzvah to do Yibum. You can't tell me there's only a mitzvah to Yibum when the Bechar is at least alive, because it's not true. But the Gemara says, how do you know that? Maybe it's talking about when the Katan died. So the Gemara says, that can't be, because we said already that if it's talking only where the Katan died, then we know that we have the mir of Eshesach Shlohay Bailamai. So if that's the case, why would you need the mir of Eshesach Shlohay Bailamai if it's anyways only talking about where the Bechar is alive? So it must be from that you see that there's a mitzvah of Yibum even if the Bechar is not alive. Says the Gemara, Ve'emek Yilek Bechar Kadam Kadam Zachar. Gemara says, I'll tell you another possibility. Maybe it's true. It's not only the Bechar that does Yibum. And not just that, you don't even need the Bechar to be alive in order for there to be a mitzvah of Yibum. Stating that, maybe when there's no Bechar, that's when the halach is Kadam, Katan, Zacha. That if the non-Bechar would do it, the non-Bechar would have an ability to do it. But the Ikka Bechar, Kadam, Katan, Zacha. Maybe if there's a Bechar, then the younger brother won't be able to. Maybe the only time the younger brother could do it is when the Bechar is not alive. But maybe if the Bechar is alive, then the younger brother can't do it. Amakra. So the Gemara says that can't be either, because it says, Ki yeshvu achim yachtab, we're makish the two brothers to each other. And just like one could do it, the other could do it. So there's a hekish in the pasuk of Kiyesh v'achim yachtav that you don't have to be a Bechar. Any one of the brothers can do it. It says v'haya Bechar is that he has a schus to come first. Oh, but at the end of the day, Kiyesh v'achim yachtav teaches me that any one of the brothers can do it. The Mishnah said mitzvah begadol yavin. What does gadol mean? It means the oldest brother. What's the Makar? The Haya Bechar. What does Bechar mean? The Bechar. Bechar means the firstborn male. From the pasuk, it sounds like he has to be a Bechar, someone that needed a pig in a bed. From the Mishnah, it sounds like the oldest brother. What happens if the Bechar Leilain was not alive? So it'll be the next brother up. He'll be the one that will have the mitzvah to do it. Is it the Bechar or is it the Gadol? From the pasuk, it's Mashma Bechar. Oh, but from the Mishnah, it's Mashma Gadol. So, the Gemara, maybe if there's a Bechar, Lahadar HaGadol, and Bechar. Maybe if there's no Bechar, maybe you don't have a mitzvah Begadol. So the Gemara says, and Alama Tani, and we know it's not the case because we went to the Bryce. Abaya Kashisha said, mitzvah Begadol Yabim, like Ratzna, that not only it doesn't have to be the Bechar, but it's always the next oldest brother that comes second. Right? The Bechar declines, so it's the next, and if that one declines, it's going to be the next one. So the Gemara says Kibachar. It's not mistaber that it should be a din of Bechar, because ma Bechar B'chayras Agarmalai. I've got the Glas Agarmalai. What's the mile of a Bechar? Right? It's not a question of Kedushas Bechar that you find, for example, in different parishes. It's about the oldest brother. He has the schos. Okay, so the oldest brother has the schos. If he's the Bechar, and if he's not a Bechar, then the oldest brother will have the schos, and after him, the second oldest brother will have the schos. It's not mistaber, says the Gemara. It should have anything to do with bechor in the very technical sense. Rather, what it probably means is, it probably means the oldest brother. Says the Gemara, one last kasha. The emo kimiyabim bechor lishkol nachlo. Kimiyabim poshet loy lishkol nachlo. Pasuk says that the brother does the yibum, he gets the whole Yerusha. Now it says the bechor is the one that gets the Yerusha when he does the Yibum. So the Gemara says, maybe Kimiyabim Bechar, if the Bechar is the one that did the Yibum, and Ochinami, he'll get the Nachlo. But Kimiyabim Pashut, what's a Pashut? Pashut is the not Bechar. If the Pashut, the brother, not the Bechar, would be the one that did the Yibum, maybe he would have got Nachlo. So the Gemara says, Amakra, it says, Yakum al Shem, Achim Arikam, and here again, the Ritva says the word Yakum is extra. So Yakum is an extra word to teach me that it doesn't matter which brother does it. Whether it's Bechar, even if it's one of the other brothers, whichever brother does the Yibum, he's the one that ends up getting the Nachlo. So the Gemara says, Al Bechar, the Kair Rachman alone. So why then did the Torah refer to this brother as a Bechar? Should have just said Gadol. Why Gadol? Why do you refer to him as a Bechar? So the Gemara says the Greyasa. It's to teach me a halacha, but a halacha that actually works against the Yava. How? Ma b'char eno noitel b'roike b'muchzik We know that Allah is that a Bechar Yarshins Pi Shnayim, right? He gets a double portion in his Yerush. Stating that there's a limitation to the Pi Shnayim, and that is he only Yarshins b'muchsek, he doesn't Yarshin b'ra'oi. So ordinarily, the halacha is if a man dies and he leaves over assets that may be coming his way, so they get divided pro rata based on however the Yerush is going to be divided. However, the Bechar's Pi Shnayim is excluded from that, being that at the time that the father died, he physically didn't have those assets in his possession. It was only something that on a contingency basis, maybe one day he was going to get. It's the halacha that a bechar is einoi noitel b'roi. He doesn't get Yerusha for something that's roi to come kibbutz like he does for something that he already physically has. So the fact that the Torah used the word bechar when describing the fact that the Yavim Yarushins his brother, it's coming to teach me that the Dina Yerusha of a Yavim works with the Dina Yerusha of a bechar. And just like bechar is einoi noitel b'roi kibbutz, so too he's not going to be noitel b'roi. But what's the bottom line? This concludes the first 2/3 of the daf, and that is V'hoya b'chor asher teled Yokum al Shem Achav Ameis V'lo Yemachish May B'Yisrael. Pasuk the pasuk it certainly sounded like that. What the pasuk is saying is that the purpose of Yibum is to have a baby, and the baby will be a hemshech of the Achames. That's not what the pasuk means. V'hoya b'chor mitzvah v'gadol yavim. Our Mishnah. That the Yavam Yarshins, his brother that died. So much so, B'hoya B'char means the B'char that we had a whole Gemara with kashas and terutzim, bullet point style, to tell me that it's not only the B'char that has a mitzvah of Yibum. You actually could have had a Havamina that only the B'char does Yibum. Why? Because that's what it says in the Torah. It says B'hoya B'char, and it's a whole chiddush that's actually not the way it is. The Mishnah. This Mishnah is going to feel like a little bit of a digression. Just going to start Amud Beis, then we'll speak out some Reid. If there's a man who's being accused of doing an Aveira of Gili Arayas, together with a Shifcha. The Shifcha Knan is a non-Jewish woman, and then the Shifcha was freed. He's a Nitan on an Ovedes Kechavim, meaning he's being accused of doing an Aveira with a non-Jewish woman. Then it's Kairo, and again, she was Negaya. So, initially, she was a shifcha, she was an Evetz Chachavim, which meant that if this man wanted to marry them, he didn't have the option to do it. But now that the shifcha was nishtachrer, and now that the Evetz Chachavim was niskayer, so really if this person would want to marry them, this is something he'd be able to do. So the Mishnah hareza lo yichnas, you're not supposed to marry them. Them kines, and if he married them, we let them stay married. We'll explain why. If someone's a nitan on an eshes ish, means someone's being accused of an aver of eshes ish, and then this eshes ish was forced to be divorced by her own husband. Why? Because an eshes ish that's mezana is also to live with her husband. So this man who's a chashuv with this eshes ish does not let him marry her, and even if he marries her, we force her to get divorced. Again, we're going to get very much into this into tomorrow's daf. But the topic of the Mishnah is a nitan, someone that's being chashuv to do an aver of gili arayis. If it's with a shifcha or a vedes kechavim, and then later the shifcha and the vedes kechavim become available because they were nishtacher or they were niskayer, you shouldn't marry them. Then kines, and if you do emetzim yadei, we allow you to stay married. If the person was nitan on an eshes ish, and now it's possible for this man to marry the eshes ish, you can't marry her. And if you do yoitzi, you're going to be forced to give her a get. Rashi says, what's this lashon hanitan? It's an interesting lashon. What's the lashon hanitan? So Rashi says chashud means chashud the way we touched it, and then Rashi says koloimer. Right? Whenever Rashi says koloimer, he's bothered with something. It's just a funny word. Hanitan, just say chashud. What does the word nitan mean? So Rashi says koloimer shetoyan in all of divrei las. A nitan is someone that they're timing about, like a nizik. A nizik is someone that somebody was mazik. So he's a nitan. They're timing about him. What are they timing? They're spreading rumors that he did averis. Either way, it's it sounds like from the Mishnah that there was a man that was nitan on an averis kechal. Let's pick that case. And then later she was a skyer, and now he wants to marry her. So the Mishnah says, now let him marry her. If he did get married, you're allowed to stay married. But it sounds like if this woman wants to be Megayer, we would allow her. Meaning we'll accept her geiras, that's okay. If she really wants to be Niskayer, we can accept her geiras. However, it's just that after she's Niskayer, this person is not supposed to marry. Is that true? Is it so poshut that this woman's geira should be accepted? That was the guy because he wanted to marry a certain woman. Or there was a woman that was megayer because she wanted to marry a certain man. Or there's someone that was megayer because of shulchan malachim, because he was told that if he becomes a yid, he's going to be shulchan malachim. He wanted to join the rank and file of the Avdei Shloimeh. All these gerim are not gerim. Why? Because it's not a sincere gerim. And if it's not a sincere gerim, it's not a gerim. Nechem used to say, Echad geri arayis, the people that were megayer because of lions. Echad geri chaloimus, or someone that was megayer because the Bala chaloimus came to him and he told him that it's a good idea. Echad geri Mordechai Esther. All the people that were megayer in the times of Mordechai Esther. Rashi says, where do you find that people were megayer in the times of Mordechai Esther? The Rabbin may ame haaretz misyahadim kinaf al pachad al Yehudim aleim. So you see, they were misyahadim. They wanted to become Jews. So the halach is all these different people. And the Chaim said, "Einam geir, they're not geir, and she's geir until they're megayer bisman hazeh." Unless they're megayer, and nowadays, bisman hazeh, but only nowadays, only today we're mekabel geir, Rav Nechemiah's times, but earlier or later not. It has to be like bisman hazeh. Meaning, geirus only works if it's not the best of times. If it's the best of times, then we're not Makabel Gerim, because then we're suspect that maybe the Gerim is not a sincere Gerim. If, however, it's happening during good times, so then already we're Choshit, and that's a problem. Kibbis, man, that's when it's going to be okay. Either way, what's the Gemara's kasha? This woman was an Avedas Kechavim. Apparently, there was some Gili Arayas between her and this man, or at least that's what the people are tanging, literally. That's what the rumor is. Now, all of a sudden, she's Megayer, and they want to get married. It certainly sounds like she's being Megayer because she wants to marry this man. It's mashma from the Mishnah, clearly implying she's a Jewish woman. Because if she's not a Jewish woman, then you can't marry her even b'diavad. So we're implying that the Geirus for sure is a Geirus. Right, the Gemara. Rav Nechemiah said that if someone's Megayer for any ulterior motives, then it can Geirus. And one of his examples were an Ish in its Geirus of Isha and an Ish in its Geirus of Ish. Doesn't this sound like an Ish that was a Geirus of Ish? The Gemara says yes. Good kasha. About it, my Rav Yitzchak Shmuel, by married to Mishmei the Rav, halach divriyayim kulam geirim. We don't pass like from the Nechemiah. If we pass like from the Nechemiah, this Mishnah would be a problem. But we don't pass like from the Nechemiah, and because we don't pass like from the Nechemiah, it's for that reason it's not a problem. Gemara says, so if that's the case, if we don't pass like from the Nechemiah, we pass that all these aforementioned people are really geirim. So chatchila nami. So then why can't he marry her? Meaning, what's the problem over here? If the geir is a good geir, so what's taktiv shad in the Mishnah? Right? Again, just revisiting the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, don't marry her l'katchila. Why not? So if there's something questionable about the Geiris, I can hear it. But if the Geiris is a good Geiris, so what's the issue? So the Gemara says, it's based on something Rav Asi said. Rav Asi said, quoting a pasuk in Mishlei, Hosem Nimcha Ikshus Peh, Ulezus Sifasayim, Harchek Mimecha. A person should not behave in a way where people are going to suspect him of doing an Aveir. And being that this person, if he ends up marrying this woman, it's going to give a lot of credence and a lot of credibility to the rumor. Right here, people were tiny that he was doing an Aveir with this woman, and the next thing you know, she's Megayer and he's married to her. That's Moshe Yisrael, albeit. But the mitzias is that from a rumor perspective, it's certainly going to give credence to the rumor, and there's an Indian that a Yid has to behave in a way where people are not going to spread things about him, even if they're not true. And it's for that reason the Mishnah says, don't get married. Now, with the Yevet, it's either. All it is a harchaka, it's a maila of some sorts. But at the same time, you're not supposed to. This no, we are not going to be Makabel Gerim L'Moisa Mashiach. Similarly, like Kiblu Gerim, they were not Makabel Gerim. Levi made David, not in times of David and Melech. To Levi made Shloimeh, not in times of Shloimeh Melech. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Micro. What's the makar to this? How do you know we're not going to be Makabel Gerim L'Moisa Mashiach? How do you know they weren't Makabel Gerim in the times of David and times of Shloimeh? Again, these are the best of times. So how do you know that's the case? Sometimes in a pasuk in Yeshaya it says, "Hein." Goyer Yogur, when do we accept Gerim? Efes meyoise. It's only when things are not good. Mi Gor Itach, when the Ger comes at a time when he has to lower himself with you, Ayin Rashi, Alayach Yipa. That's when he's going to end up in Eilam Haba. That's when the Geris is going to be a Geris. There's a few very geschmack Tosfos and right here on this Amud. We're not going to talk about it now, but the Be'ezus Hashem, we have to put a bookmark here. We have to come back to some short, light, Gishmak Tosfos. One of the Tosfos that's just worth mentioning, and that is the Gemara says that Ein Makabel Gerim b'mei Shloimeh. That in times of Shloimeh Melech, we weren't Makabel Gerim. Great Tosfos, it's a pella. Everyone knows that Shloimeh Melech married the daughter of Paroi. He married Bas Paroi, and obviously she had a Geirus, because if she didn't have a Geirus, then it's not possible that Shloimeh Melech would have been able to marry her. So, Freit Tosfos, how could you tell me they weren't Makabel Gerim in the times of Shloimeh Melech? One of the most famous converts in Jewish history, in Tanakh, was Bas Paroi, who was Megayer at the time of Shloimeh Melech. So Tosfos says a Geshmak Teretz. Tosfos says, what's the reason we weren't Makabel Gerim in the times of Shlomo HaMelech? Because it was so good to be a Yid at that time that we were concerned that if someone's being Megayer, so maybe it's not sincere. But Bas Paroi, she anyways had it so good. She was coming from the family of Paroi. So she wasn't incentivized in any way. It's not like she was marrying up in the sense that, oh, now she's married. She anyways came from Malachin. So the fact that she was joining Klal Yisrael during this time really is not any reason to assume that it would have been insincere. For the fact that she would have a good life living in Yerushalayim, yeah, she had a good life living in Cairo. So she didn't necessarily have to do that. So it says, Tosfos Zilbasa time. What's the whole reason we're not Makabel Gerim in the times of Shlomo HaMelech? It's based on that. So as it relates to Bas Pari, this is not something that would have been applicable. Stating that, it's Yodua the Rambam, in Perek Yud Gimel, Hilchos Yisuri B'Yah, some of the most famous Lashonis in the Rambam, tucked away. The Rambam over there is answering this question. He's mamish addressing this inyan. It's very rare that the Rambam asks a kasha and gives a teretz in the Ziyad Chazaka. This is like a ve'im toimer and a ve'yesh shloimer of the Rambam. Ayin Sham, unfortunately, because of the little bit of time we have, we can't go into this. So we'll, as far as Reid goes, return to the beginning of the daf and talk about what the majority of the daf discussed, and that is, it says in the Torah, the purpose of Yibum is v'haya b'chor ashetele yakum al shem achav ames v'lo yimache shmoi b'Yisrael. And Rava said that even though in kol haTorah kula ein mikra yotze v'dei pshuta, this pasuk is the one pasuk in the entire Torah where the emes pshat in the pasuk is not the pasuk pshat. The pshat in the pasuk sounds like that the child that's going to be born through the Yibum should be named after the Achames, so that we will assure that V'lo Yimachish might be Yisrael. But the Gemara says not what the pasuk means. In fact, the Bechor that this pasuk is talking about is not the child that's born; it's talking about the Yavim. How so? Mitzvah begadol Yavim. Ashetele is pralailinus. What does Yakum al Shem Achav mean? Not name the baby after the Achames. What it means is he should be a Yerush. V'lo Yimachish might be Yisrael. Pratlasos. That's the Josh of the Gemara, based on a Brisa, really rooted in our Mishnah, and with Rava's very, very famous line in Shas, that even though Kol HaTorah Kula Ein Mikra Yotzim V'dei Pshuta, but Hoch over here, Asoy Gzeir Shava, Afikte Mipashte Legan. And it certainly sounds like from this Gemara, that even though when you Mavasedra, in Parshas Kiseitze, it sounds like there's a halacha, that the first child that was born from the Yavim, the Yevamos, was named after the Achames, Aber. It's clear in the Gemara that that's not the pshat. Yeah, it's true. There's one exception to the rule, and it just so happens this is the exception to the rule. Stating that it's not so posh. And just two rayas that it's not so posh from the Gedolei Rishonim. The first one's from a Rashi, and the second one's from a Ramban. So we know that there's two parashiyos of Yibum that I mentioned in the Torah Shabbat. One is in Parashas Vayeshev, the story of Yehuda and Tamar, and the other one is in Ksuvim, it's in Megillas Rus, regarding Boyaz and Rus. So what's the short version of the Maisa in Parashas Vayeshev? The pasuk says that Yehuda was married, he had 3 sons, and he had a daughter-in-law, Tamar. Yehuda's oldest son was married to Tamar, and then died, and he left over no children. So Yehuda went to Einon, and he said, your brother died, he didn't leave over any children. So go to your brother's wife, Tamar, and do Yibum, so like this, you'll be Hakim Zera Lachicha. Now the pasuk says Einon didn't want to do Yibum, and of course the rest is history. Zok the Hilger Rashi. It's Rashi al Torah. It's in Parshas Vayeshev. It's Perek Lamed Ches. It's pasuk Ches. What did Yehuda mean when he told Einon, Boya Leishim Sachicha v'Yabim Moisa v'Hakim Zera Lachicha? One line. Habein Yikare al Shem Ames. What he told him is that you should do Yibum. You're going to have a baby, and when the baby is born, you know what you should name the baby? The Yikare Shmoi B'Yisrael Er. That's like Rashi. So Rashi says, what was he telling him to do? Have a baby, then name the baby after the brother that died. Take the Ramban. How could that be? It's a Gemara in Yevamos Daf Chaf Daled and Aleph. That even though it does say in the parasha of Yibum language that would seem to suggest this, Yokum al Shem Achav Ameis, but Rav already said that this pasuk is not the pasuk pshat. Even though Kol HaTorah Kula would be Yotzei V'dei Pshuta, this is the one exception to the rule. So why would Rashi be mefarish a pasuk that Yehuda is telling, go ahead and do Yibum v'Hakim Zera that I think you call al Shem Ameis? Oh, but as I say Rashi, it's a Rashi al Torah in Parshas Vayeshev. The Ramban, interestingly, is the other Rishon, or a other Rishon, I should say, that says this, and it's in Parshas Pinchas. The context over there is actually very, very fascinating. It's a little complex, but we're learning Yevamos. I think we can handle this. And the pasuk over there is talking about the different families that are mentioned in Parshas Pinchas, right? So there's different parashas in the Torah where there's different mishpachas that are mentioned. It feels a little bit repetitive. So, for example, just to get a feel for what's happening in Parshas Pinchas. So Moshe Rabbeinu is counting Klal Yisrael, and he's counting them with mishpachosam. Reuven, Bechor Yisrael, Bnei Reuven, Chanoich, Mishpachas HaChanoichi, Lefalu, Mishpachas HaPalui, Lechetzron, Mishpachas HaChetzroni, Lekami, Mishpachas HaKarmi, Eila, Mishpachas HaRuveni. And then you have Bnei Shimon, Lenemuel, Mishpachas HaNemueli, Leyomi, Mishpachas HaYomini, Leyochim, Mishpachas HaYochim. Ramban, in this parsha here, in the middle of Parashas Pinchas, it's the long Ramban. The Ramban says that if you look at which families got names, like Mishpachas HaNemueli, Mishpachas HaYomini, Mishpachas HaYochini, so the Ramban says that it's all the people that were alive at the time that Yaakov Avinu and his Mishpacha descended onto Mitzrayim. So we know B'shivin Nefesh Yardu Aviseinu Mitzrayim. We're going to say it soon in the Agadah Shal Pesach. So whoever was a member of those 70, they're the ones that would go down as being the families. So Nemuel is one of the 70, and that's why in Parashas Pinchas there's the Mishpachas HaNemueli. Yomin is one of them, so therefore he goes down as Mishpachas HaYomini. Yochin is one of them, so he goes down as the Mishpachas HaYochin. Says the Ramban, if you go through all the different names, this works, with the exception of two. There's two names that is inconsistent with this klal. There are two names, and that's why the Bnei Binyamin. The pasuk says Bnei Binyamin LaMishpachosam, Levela Mishpachas HaBali, LaAshbel Mishpachas HaAshbeli, LaAchiram Mishpachas HaAchorini, L'shfufa mishpachas hashufami, l'chufa mishpachas hachufami. The pasuk lists 5 sons of Binyamin, and they all have families. They're patriarchs of their respective mishpacha. Vayiyu b'nei Bela. Now Bela, who was one of the sons of Binyamin, so he had 2 sons, Ard v'Namon. Says the pasuk mishpachas ha'ardi and l'Namon mishpachas ha'nami. That's what the pasuk says. Now Ard and Namon were Einoklach of Binyamin. These Einoklach were born already in Mitzrayim. And yet you have the Mishpachas HaArdi and you have the Mishpachas HaNami. So fragt the Ramban that he doesn't understand how this is consistent, how this stems with Pasuk Pshat, how you read the Psukim here in Parashas Pinchas. So he brings that Ramosha Darshan already asked this kasha, and Ramosha Darshan said a Pshat, and then he brings another Pshat that he saw, but he says, I'm going to give a suggestion. I've seen the Rishonim make different Pshatim, but I think you can say the Pshat is like this. He says as follows. The emes is Binyamin, the pasuk lists as having 5 sons. Right? This pasuk mentions 5 mishpachas that came from Binyamin. Binyamin really had more than 5 sons. We know how many sons Binyamin had. Binyamin really had 10 sons. So what happened to his other 5 sons? Bechura, they weren't alive anymore. They died. Because they died, so therefore they weren't zoicha to have mishpachas. And because they didn't have mishpachas, it's for that reason they're now listed over here in Parshas Pinchas. Says the Ramban, if you look carefully at the names of Binyamin's sons, Ubnei Binyamin, Bela, Vavecher, Va'ashbel, Gera, V'Namon, Aches Ferosh, Mupim V'Chupim, V'Ord. So the 2 Einoklach of Binyamin that are mentioned as having families here in Parashas Pinchas, the sons of Bela ben Binyamin are Naaman and Ard. It just so happens that Binyamin had 2 sons, Naaman and Ard, who are not alive here in Parashas Pinchas. They're not patriarchs of their respective families, but he did have 2 such sons. Is that a coincidence? The Ramban says, I don't think it's a coincidence. I'm going to tell you what I think happened. He says, you want to know what happened? Ki Erd v'Naaman b'nei Binyamin mesu. They died. But they didn't have any sons. And then Bela, who was one of Binyamin's other sons, he wanted to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum. So how was he being Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum? So what did he do? He was Miyabim Eshes Ard and Eshes Naaman. And then he had a baby. And when he had a baby, he named them Ard and Naaman to be Mekayim this Indian of Mekim Shem Yisrael. And then he says, and it makes so much sense. You know why? He was the oldest son. Because if you look in Binyamin's family, when it lists his 10 sons are coming to life in Parashas Pinchas. If you look at Ubnei Binyamin, Bela, First Bella, then Vecher and Ashbel and Geir and Nachir. But first is Bella, because that's the halacha. The halacha is mitzvah b'gadol Yabim. So Bella was the oldest son. He wanted to be the kind of mitzvah of Yibum. So he was Miyabim Eishes Naaman, and then he was Miyabim Eishes Ard, and then he named the child Naaman and Ard, and that's where these children of Naaman and Ard came from. But here's the point: that being that so alumnus in a pasuk pshat in a technical pasuk, he says that being that Ard and Naaman, although they were Bnei Bella, but what was their tachlis? Shame of the Naaman and the Ard that were really the sons of Binyamin, and those sons of Binyamin were from the Yotzei Mitzrayim, and they technically had the schus in having families, and they're coming now in lieu of them. So therefore, they was like the families because they're not just Ein L'Kucha Binyamin. They're really there. That's what their purpose is. That's what their tachlis is. That's why they have the name. That's why Bella's the father, because he's the oldest brother, because he's the mitzvah of the Yabim. And I'll call Yomi on Chaim b'Shalom. Azoy shteit the Ramban. So we have two Rishonim. We have Rashi in Parshas Vayeshev, and then we have the Ramban in Parshas Pinchas. You have to know how the two Rambans did, not for now. But you have a Rashi and a Ramban that both say the same exact thing. That the Mitzvah is there was this idea of naming after the Achames. So here's the kasha. I said, "Shtim Argumar." Argumar said clearly, "Amar Rava." Rava said, "Afal gaf the b'chal Torah kulei mikri yotzim the b'shutoy hachasoy gzeir shava afikte mi pashte legamre." It's the whole shaykh is not the pshat in the pasuk. It's the one time in the entire Torah that you find that the pasuk pshat is nit emes. So how does it shtim? Here you have a Rashi in Parshas Vayeshev talking about the Yibum of Yehuda and Tamar, and here you have the Rabban, who, by the way, this would be the third Yibum that we have in Torah Shebek. We've been talking about the two. This would be number 3. We're here too with this whole Yibum that happened with the son of Binyamin, and he's again being mefarish based on the Pashup Pshat, which the Gemara said is really not the emes. But the Pshat is Pashup. It's very, very Pashup. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, Amar Rav, even though Kol HaTorah Kula Emek Yotzim V'Dei Pshutai, over here, Asoy Gzeir Shava, V'Afikte V'Pashte Dekra Legamri. Over here, the Pashup Pshat is not the Pashup Pshat. So Rashi, what does it mean, V'Afikte Legamri? She'ein Tzarech Likrois L'Bnoi B'Shem Achav Ames. Rashi says that you know what it means, that over here, the Mikra is Yotzim V'Dei Pshutai? What it means is you don't have to name the child after the Achames. Rashi didn't say there's no Inyan to do it. It's not what Rashi said. What Rashi is saying is you don't have to. Meaning when it says in the Pasuk, Yakum al Shem Achiv, the Pasuk is telling me a din, a chiyuv, a mitzvah. So Rava, that's not true. A chiyuv does not. You want to know if there's an Inyan? There's an Inyan. And that's why Yehuda told Oinon, go ahead and you should name your child that. And that's pshat over here in or than now. Because Avada is an Indian. What does it mean that over here Mikri is Yotzim V'Dei Pshutai? So no, you're dashing the Pashup Pshat. No, we're not dashing the Pashup Pshat. Because the Pashup Pshat is that there's a chiyuv. The Pashup Pshat is Yokum al Shem Achav Ames. That this is something you have to do. The Torah is telling you what to do. The Torah is not telling you to do that. The Torah is saying that the Bechar is the one that has a schus to do Yibum, and when he does Yibum, Yokum Hashem Achiv Ames L'nach. That's what the Torah is telling you. But at the same time, you see from the pasuk that Epis is an Indian here. You see something, and because you see something, that's why Rashi in Parshas Vayeshev was mefarish the way he was mefarish, and that's why the Ramban in Parshas Pinchas was mefarish the way he was mefarish as well. That's Pashup Pshat. To be miyashiv the Rishonim, because otherwise you push it. It's a plea in this gava adnoy. But that's the Pashup Pshat. But one thing then you see in Yibum, something you see agav, is this chashivos of naming after somebody. So you're naming a child, and you decided what name to give. You see there's an inyan to name a child. It's a covet, it's a zach, to name a child after somebody that died. It's clear. As I state, you see here in Yibum that there's an inyan to name a child after somebody that died. And the truth is that it's a medrash, it's a chazal. This is Makar to this, the medrash is in Parshas Noach that talks about this Indian. But that same medrash says that although there's an Indian, it's not always the way it was. The medrash says, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Yossi and Shimon ben Gamliel argued. They said something similar, but at the same time, they didn't say the same thing. Rabbi Yossi said, Harishonim in the earlier generations, Al Yidei Shahayu Makirim as Yichuseim. because people were familiar with their yichus. So when they used to name a child, they would name the child l'shem ha'ma'ira. They would name it based on something that was going on in the world at that time. Right? You go through all the psukim in the Torah, you see why people got their names, the shvatim or whoever it was. It was always from l'shem ha'ma'ira. Aval anu, but he says we don't really know our yichos. So anu, us, mitzi and l'shem aviseinu. Instead, we're mitzi l'shem aviseinu. So he says that the Friya, the Gedairis, they were makirim yichusein. So when they used to name, they would name l'shem ha'ma'ir. We don't know our yichus so much, so we name after people. What does that mean? They were makir their yichus. People used to live very, very long. And because people used to live very long, so you're going to name after the Zayd. The Zayd is 871 years old. Everyone knows him. He's seen already 14 generations. He's beseder. So they didn't feel that it was such a need, it was such a tzarich to go ahead and do it. So what did they do? They used to name l'shem ha'ma'ir. He says, we're not makir yichuseinu anymore, because unfortunately now it's in nation they say them shivim shana, then the gurish oinim shana. Now it's already different. So Leibig isn't the hype, is 120. It's not the way it used to be. It's not the good old days. So therefore, for us, anu might see l'shem ha'ma'ir. Therefore, it's considered a kavod zach to name after the elder. That's what Rabbi Yossi said. Roshim Gamliel said, Harishonim. In the early generations, because people used to use Ruach HaKodesh, so they used to name l'shem ha'ma'ir because they had Ruach HaKodesh. So because they had Ruach HaKodesh, they knew what names to give. Aval anu us, she'en anu mishtamshim b'Ruach HaKodesh. We who don't have Ruach HaKodesh anymore, so we can't use Ruach HaKodesh to figure out what names to give. So therefore, when it comes to us giving names, we just name after the Zaydis. But either way, so this is a makar from a medrash in Parshas Noach that talks about naming after the Zaydis, that the chshivos of giving a name, which is rooted in shtickle in the Parsha of Yibum, because you see, give the name. What do you mean? I thought Rabbi said that's not the Pashup Shah in the Pasuk, and over here, meaning it is the Pashup Shah in the Pasuk, but we don't go with the Pashup Shah in the Pasuk, but Rashi Parshas Vayeshev, the Ramban Parshas Pinchas. So you see at the end of the day that there is such a zach. And so in the Parashah of Yevamos, it's already rooted that there is something to a name and it's a covered zach. There's a hemshechinim by going ahead and naming in that thing. But it wasn't always like that. Now in the Shpeit of the Gedairis, this is the way it is. But the Rishonim and the Friya of the Gedairis, this is not the way it was. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon, one said that they used to do it l'shem ha'ma'ir, and the other one said that they used to do it al pi ruach hakodesh. But the bottom line is that's the way names used to be given. There's an interesting tshuva from the Divrei Malkiel. So who is the Divrei Malkiel? The Divrei Malkiel, his name was Malkiel Tenenbaum. He lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Passed away in the year 1910. He was the Rav in Lomja. He was a Veloshin Talmud. He was a Goy in Oilam. Wrote several chalakim of Tshuvas, Kederech, of the Groisen Yeshivim of the 19th century. And in Chelik Gimel, Divrei Malkiel, Simin Ayin Hey, he was asked a very interesting question. The question that he was asked there was a man who had a daughter whose name was Simcha. And now he had a boy, and he wants to name his son Simcha. Simcha is a name that you find girls have, and it's a name that you find boys have. And the question was, if he already has a daughter named Simcha, could he now name his son Simcha as well? Because Chaim had a daughter Simcha. And of course, he had Remeir Simcha, v'chulu, v'chulu. But the bottom line is that Simcha is a girl's name and it's a boy's name. So this was the question. The question was, if you already have a daughter whose name is Simcha, could you now name a boy Simcha? So it says, the emes is that you find in Tanakh that there were people that had two children that had the same name. He gives examples, Ayin Shah. But he says it's pasha to him that was then. Today you would not be able to do it anymore. He says why? He says based on this medrash, because it's mavur in this medrash that the Rishonim and the Friya the Gedairis, they used to name based on Ruach HaKodesh. They used to name based on a Ma'ura, something that happened. So if their Ruach HaKodesh said to name two children with the same name, that's what they did. You always follow the Ruach HaKodesh. Right? If the Ma'ura warranted that two children should have the same name, so this is something that they would do because it was based on the Ma'ura. But he says, hi. And already in the times of Chazal, the Medrash already said, we name based on Aviseinu, we name based on the Zaydis, that's how we give names. So if this is the way that we give names, says the Divrei Malkiel, it's posted that based on that, you would not give two children the same name, you should only give a name once, as out of a covenant, and after that you should. And he says it doesn't matter if one is a boy and the other one's a girl, it's the same difference, it's not something you should do. And then he gets involved in a whole side discussion in terms of names, and then at the very, very end, he says that the emes is ubalav hachi. He says, besides, ani tameya I find this to be a very, very big chiddush. That you find that there are women that have boys' names. He says it's not appropriate. And there's many, many chashashos. The zeichel l'davar, and he says if you want a zeichel l'davar, yesh iser. There's a law in the Torah that says that a woman is not allowed to wear simlas gever, and the same is true that a man is not allowed to wear the begadim of a woman. So he says based on that, the different malkil, this whole shiloh that you would have a name that somehow would be appropriate for a boy and a girl. He says I'm not comfortable with this because really it should be a boy's name or it should be a girl's name. It's a big tmiyah to me. What happened to Lei Sildash? You're wearing a name that belongs to a woman, or a woman's wearing a name that belongs to a man. He says, I think it's inappropriate, and because it's inappropriate, I don't think this is something you should do. So last week, Klal Yisrael lost the Gadol Adar, the Sarat Torah, Hagoyin, Hagadol, Chaim, Kanievsky, Zechet Tzadik, the Kodesh Levrach. So it's obviously impossible to even attempt to say Divrei Hesped, Al Hagoyin, but at the same time, there's a piece in the Sefer Time of the Krah. It's in Parshas Kiseitze, where Chaim Kanievsky quotes this Divrei Malkiel. He quotes this Divrei Malkiel. The Divrei Malkiel suggestion that he says that he thinks that it's inappropriate to have a woman who's going to have a man's name and a man that's going to have a woman's name, just like men wear men's clothing and women wear women's clothing. There's a lot in the Torah, like Silvash. So too, when it comes to names, he said it should be delineated in the same exact way. Men should have men's names and women should have women's names. This was the ha'ara of the Divrei Malkiel. So Reb Chaim said that even though in Shuvas Divrei Malkiel it's mavur that this is not a good thing, but at the same time, Aval Hanira, Midivrei HaPoiskim v'Chazal v'Rishonim shlo yichashu l'zeh. He says, but if you look in Chazal and the Rishonim, it's clear that this is not something that we're worried about. Like you find in many Mekaymas. And then Kalach Hayad, these are short ha'aras. If you're familiar with the Sefer Time of the Krah, they're not long shtiklach. They're very, very short shtiklach. Kalach Hayad, Reb Chaim Kanievsky brings 79 examples. Ayin Tes example, dugmois, of where you find in Chazal and on the Rishonim level and in Shuvas where there were men that had women names or women that had men names. It's kedai to just go through a little bit, and this is Pasha the Hesped on Reb Chaim Kanievsky. Avi Bas Zecharia. There was a woman, her name was Avi Bas Zecharia, Imay Shel Chizkiyahu. She was Chizkiyahu's mother. Malachim Beis Perik Yud Ches. Motzinu Amoira. You find an Amoira whose name was Reb Avi. Mesechtes Soifrim Perik Yud Beis Halacha Va. So in Melachim Beis Perik Yud Ches, you have Avi as a woman's name, and then in Masechta Sofer Perik Yud Beis Halacha Vav, you have Avi, that's a man's name. Avia ben Rechavam, Melech Yehuda, right? Rechavam was the son of Shloim, and he had a son whose name was Avia. It's a pasuk in Divrei Hayom Beis Perik Yud Aleph. Ubesoif Medrash Rus, and in the end of Medrash Rus again you find Rabbi Yaakov bar Avia, Rabbi Yaakov bar Avia. Yet umatzinu Avia Ishes Chetzrain. You find that Chetzrain had a wife whose name was Avia. This is in Divrei Hayom and Aleph Perik Beis, and you have Avia who was Bas Zecharia, and this is in Divrei Hayom and Beis Perik Chav. Avital Safra. There was someone whose name was Avital. It's a Yalkut in Daniel. It's also a Gemara Moed Daf Yud Chesam and Aleph. Yet you find that David HaMelech had a wife whose name was Avital. Shmuel Beis Perik Gimel. Adonia ben Chagis. That's in Shmuel Beis Perik Gimel. Umatzinu Adonia Eshes Melech Kush, the king of Kush, the king of Ethiopia, had a wife, Adonia. How do you know that? It's in Sefer HaYashar. So Sefer HaYashar is an old Sefer that talks about different Meiselach, and it mentions things that happen in the Amalek Zeiten. And over there it talks about a king from Kush, and he had a wife whose name was Adonia. So you have Adonia ben Chagis in Shmuel Beis, and you have Adonia, you have Ahava Breder Reb Zera. Reb Zera had a son whose name was Ahava. It's a Gemara in Eruvin, Daf Tzadik Vav on the days. Yet there's a sefer called Shem Chadash, where it goes through all the Shemes HaGittin, and over there, when he lists the ladies' names, so one of the ladies' names that he mentions is the name of Ahava. Move along a little bit, I'm skipping. Zusha. The name Zusha, is it a man's name or a woman's name? So you think it's a man's name, right? So he says in the Beis Shmuel, who wrote a Shemes HaGittin, he chronicled all the names for Gittin, right? When you learn Gittin, it's very important to know names and the spelling of names. So in Shemes HaGittin, Zusha, when he has his list of men, so over there, the Beis Shmuel mentions Zusha. But if you look in the Sefer Shem Chadash, so when he goes through his list of names, when he talks about all the women names, he mentions Zusha. So you have in the Beis Shmuel, he names it by the men, and in the Shem Chadash, he names it by the women. So obviously, it must have been a name that men had, or it must have been a name that women had. Zisol. What about Zisol? So he says, if you look in the Sefer Get Mesudar, that's also a Sefer that lists Shemos HaGittin. So it mentions over there the name Zisol. Yet in Shem Chadash, it lists it by the names of women. What about Zemel? We have a Reid about the name Zemel. But what about the name Zemel? He says there too, in the Get Mesudar, he has it on the side of all the men. And then in the Shem Chadash, it's in the bottom section. It's together with the women. So you see over here, some of them had it by the men, some had it by the women. Now, no one was making a mistake. There must have been a name of a man. It must have been the name of a woman. Chushin. Here's another one, a name we're familiar with. Chushin ben Dan. Parshas Vayigash. Yet, Divrei Hayamim Aleph. Chushin Eshes Shacharim. You have to know the very Mal, but it's right there. There's the name of Chushin. Yoel. The name Yoel. So Yoel, of course, is a man's name, right? So Yoel Anovi. Yet, Ubetikun Seifrin, in the Hashmatis to the Hagois, Ois Nun, there was a woman. Her name was Yoel Eshes Rab Zelki. Her husband's name was Zelki, and her name was Yoel. So Chaim said, I found the name Yoel also. Yoina Hanavi, right? Yona. So that's a name that you find on the men's side and on the ladies' side. Yoim HaNavi, Umatzinu b'medrash Ksav Yad, Sheshem Eshes Asher Yoina. Asher of Shvatim fame, so his wife's name was Yoina. Rab Yeshua, the name Yeshua. So he said, I found the name Yeshua ben Rab Yosef. He was the mechaber of the sefer called Alichas Olam. Yet in the Shem Chodesh, when talking about the Shem Esagitin, he mentioned Yeshua as being a woman's name. There's the name Mazel Tov. He said, I found the name Mazel Tov. He said there was a Yid, his name was Rab Mazel Tov Mimodina. He wrote a sefer called Pirurei Lechem. So he says, it's quoted in the sefer Pleit HaSoif from Oy Zayin, Simen Tov Yud. Yet in the Yad HaHara, in Hilchas Gittin, when he lists all the names of women, he lists the name as Mazel Tov, as being one of the names of a woman. Miriam. That's easy, right? Miriam Hanaviyah. V'gam b'Gemara b'Tzniru Shem Yisnoshim b'Shem Zeh. Goes through the whole list. Miriam HaTarmudis, Miriam Bas Nachtum. Or some have the Gerson Miriam Bas Tanchum, Miriam Bas Eli B'Tzolim, Miriam Bas Bilga, Miriam Megadla Nashia, Miriam Megadla Dardiki of the beginning of Chagiga fame, Miriam Upurta Sarah, Miriam Imoy Shal Abishal, Miriam Bitoy Shal Shimon Ben Guria, Miriam Bitoy Shal Naktimoy, Umikamaka. And he says, yeah, although of course Miriam is a woman's name, but you find Gamkein Rabbi Lazar ben Miriam. There was a Rabbi Lazar ben Miriam in Rus Rabbah, Perik Dalet Simintes. And he's assuming that if his name was Rabbi Eliezer ben Miriam, then Miriam must be the father. Because usually when Chazal say Atana, ben someone, usually it's ben the father's name. Marta Bas Baisus, the name Marta. Marta, man's name, or it's a lady's name. Marta Bas Baisus. Yevamos Samach Aleph, coming up. Yumud Yotches, Ksubas Kuf Dalet, Gittin Nun Vav, Sukkah, Nun Beis, Matzinu Gamkein, Marta, Mishmei Rabbi Yeshua, B'Sachim Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph, B'Sanhedrin Hey Amud Aleph. Ivoy, the Chana, the Shela, Umarta, V'Rabchia, Kula B'nei Abba Baracha Karsel Mikafrahab. They're all brothers. Marta is one of the brothers. So you see, Marta is also a man's name. Uberashbam Baba Basra and Beis Amud Aleph, Shem Chacham, Achiv Shal Rabchia. Then he says, but he found in the Sefer Margolis Hayam, Masechta Sanhedrin, quotes Rabbi Margolis from Chaim. So he says in the Sefer Margolis Hayam, quoting Rabbi Margolis, Hevi Mitshuvas Hagoinim, Shemarta Hoysen Ekeva, Achoyset Rabchia. Rab Nurai, right? Rab Nurai was one of the names of Rab Meir. Rab Nurai, Kedushin Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Ubatzinu Nurai, Achsei Rab Yehuda Nasiya, Yerushalmi Brachas, Perik Gimel Alach Aleph. It's enough in the Yerushalmi, the third parak of Masechtas Brachas. There was a Yid whose name was Nurai, and he was the sister of Rab Yehuda, Serach Bas Asher. It's a classic lady's name. Serach Bas Asher, Seit Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Ubatzinu B'Yalkit Bahaloischa, Remes Tovshin Lamid Vav. That over there, the Yalkut mentions the 70 skenim of Shevet Yehuda. Every Shevet had 70 skenim. And when it lists the 70 skenim of Shevet Yehuda, one of the skenim that it lists is Serach. Serach is one of the Etel. Etel is the name of a woman. That's usually what you think. He quotes from the Shemes HaGittin. Is an Esther Rabbah, Perik Beis Simen Hey, Rav Chanina Bar Etel. This is Rav Chanina Bar Etel. It's clearly a man. Tzipar. What about Tzipar? Tzipora. What about Tzipar? Balak ben Tzipar. Umatzinu Gamkein Tzipar Bas Avshalom, Yerushalmi Gittin, Perakei, Halacha Gimel. Tzofnas Paneach. The name Tzofnas. Is that a man's name or is that a lady's name? Reb Chaim knew. Tzofnas Paneach. It was Yosef. So you see, it was a man's name. Yet Umatzinu Tzofnas Bas Paniel. It's a Gemara Gittin. Nun Ches Amud Aleph. What about the name Shalom? So Shalom is a man's name. Shalom ben Yovish. Malachim Beis Tezva, Bechin Shalom ben Tikva, Shalom ben Yoshio, Shalom, Brilliance, Rabbi Perik Ramad Alad, Simen Tetz, Rav Shalom, Latzinu Gamkin, Ima Shalom, Ishla, Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer's famous wife was Ima Shalom. Simcha, he brings the name Simcha. So Simcha is the name of a man. Sukkah mem Ches Amud Beis, Toisvis Yuma mem Vav Amud Beis quotes a Rabbeinu Simcha. Umatzinu b'Tshuvas Maril, he says he found the Tshuvas Maril, Simen und Zayin, Achois Mara Simcha. And Tamar, what about the name of Tamar? So Tamar was Eshes Yehuda. Tamar was the sister of Avshalom. Ubas Avshalom. Yevamos Amud Beis. We're going to learn about Tamar Shal Beis Rebbe. Yushalmi Megillah Perigimel Alacha Beis Tamar Tamrurim. Yet Umatzinu Yushalmi Beya Perikei Alacha Beis. The Girsa. According to one girsa, Tamar bar Idi, u'b'tshuvas harosh, klal nun ches, Rab Tamar. And then he said, I found a tshuva in the Marach Or Zarua who refers to a Menachem Rab Tamar. So he said, you find Tamar, even though it's a lady's name, but you find that it was a man's name as well. So it says Reb Chaim, that Avshe b'harbi mehem yesh lidchois kamuvan. I skipped around. That even though a lot of these things need to be doicha. Why? He says sometimes the nekudas are a little bit different. Sometimes I'm assuming that because it says Ben Miriam, that Miriam must have been the father. Maybe it's really the mother. The guy said the shem shall goying like Balak Ben Sipar. So maybe there's a difference between Sipar. If it's Balak Ben Sipar, it was not a yid. Versus Sipar, that's a yid. Says Roiv of these cases is absolutely Eisen, and Roiv of these things you can't think so. So the bottom line is that the different Malkiel was discussing Derech Agav. He says that this whole shayla that was brought to me regarding the name Simcha, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable because I understand that somebody even had a Havamina to name a son and a daughter with the same name, as if to say that it would be shayach such a thing. But either it's a boy's name or it's a girl's name. And l'chayr, there has to be a mechitza between the two names because otherwise it's going to be a lav of le'yilbash and le'silbash. This is not something you're allowed to do. It's a ha'ara that he says. It's something that bothered the divrei malkil. So Chaim, that and the Chanami, I hear of a mechilas kvoidai. He said, I have 79 rayas that you find. There were times and there were instances where there were people that had names, sometimes interchangeable, names of a boy and names of a girl.